Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big topics by going straight to the source. You've heard of the cloud, right? Well, today we're going to go on a physical journey to find out where the internet actually lives. We'll follow your data from the pitch-black bottom of the ocean all the way up into space.
All right, let's kick things off with a question that seems super simple, but trust me, the answer is, well, it's pretty surprising. Think about it. When you fire off an email or binge watch your favorite show, where does all that data really go?
I mean, we all say it, right? It's in the cloud. And you kind of picture this, this fluffy digital heaven where all our files and photos just hang out. Yeah, that's not how it works at all, not even close.
The internet's real home is physical, and for the most part, it's at the bottom of the ocean. We're talking cold, dark, and shockingly fragile. The truth is, it's way more solid, and honestly, way more interesting than some vague idea of a cloud.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's dive deep into this first layer, this huge, hidden network that's pretty much the backbone of our entire digital life.
What you're looking at here are submarine cables. And get this, there are almost 1.5 million kilometers of these fiber optic wires snaked across the ocean floor. To put that in perspective, that's enough cable to wrap around the entire planet nearly 38 times. These things are the real arteries of the internet, the actual physical veins carrying pretty much all of our international data.
Okay, but here's where it gets kind of wild. For something so important, this system is incredibly fragile. We're talking over 100 cable breaks a year. And the cause? It's not what you think. It's not some James Bond villain or sharks trying to get a snack. Nope, a full 75% of the time, it's just fishing boats and ship anchors. Just regular, everyday accidents. The biggest danger to the global internet is, well, us, accidentally.
Now, that's not to say it's all accidents. As these cables have become more and more vital, they've also popped up on the radar as potential targets. You've got ships like the Russian naval vessel Yantar, which is basically a deep-sea spy ship, lurking around major cable lines. And that, of course, raises some pretty serious flags about a different kind of threat, deliberate tampering or even sabotage.
So let's come up for air a bit and move from the seabed to the surface. Because it turns out, the exact same kind of vulnerability we see with our data, well, it also applies to the physical stuff, the actual goods that keep our economies running. And it all comes down to something called a choke point.
So what's a choke point? It's exactly what it sounds like. A narrow waterway, like a strait or a canal, that forces a ton of ship traffic into a tiny little space. It's the perfect spot for an accident, or even an ambush. And these spots are critical bottlenecks, not just for the giant container ships up top, but for the data cables running along the seabed right underneath them. And if you want a perfect example of how bad this can get, look no further than the Ever Given incident back in 2021. You remember this, right? One single ship gets wedged sideways in the Suez Canal. Just one ship. And within days, you've got a traffic jam hundreds of ships long. And the entire global supply chain is thrown into absolute chaos.
And the internet? Well, the internet completely lost its mind. It was this bizarre mix of genuine panic and, a million hilarious memes. But it really drove home just how interconnected everything is, and honestly, how fragile the whole system is.
And here's the thing, that crazy fragility we saw with the Suez Canal, that wasn't a one-off. It's baked into the system. You're seeing just a handful of the other major global choke points here, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the Strait of Malacca. These are all places where one little disruption can cause a massive global headache.
So you can probably guess that controlling these choke points, or at least having safe passage through them, is a huge deal for global powers. China is a great example. A whopping 80% of its oil has to go through the Strait of Malacca. That's such a massive vulnerability for them that they even have a name for it. They call it the Malacca Dilemma.
Okay, so this all brings up a pretty obvious question, right? If these undersea cables are so vulnerable, why don't we just, go over them? What about satellites? Well, turns out it's not quite that easy.
Look, satellites are fantastic for getting internet to hard-to-reach places. But when you put them head-to-head with fiber optic cables, it's not even a contest. Fiber is just ridiculously faster and way more reliable. And then there's latency. That's the lag, the time it takes for the signal to get going. With fiber, it's almost instant. With a satellite, your data has to travel all the way up to space and all the way back down. It just can't keep up.
And here's the real kicker. Satellites aren't some totally separate magical sky internet. They're just an add-on to the one we already have on the ground. The satellite has to beam its signal down to a physical building, a ground station. And guess what that ground station does? It plugs right back into the very same fiber network we started with.
So all we've really done is trade one choke point for another. The weak link isn't the satellite whizzing around in orbit. It's the building on the ground that's catching the signal.
And believe it or not, it gets even more complicated. There's this new trend called Ground Segment as a Service, GSSAS for short. The idea is to run all the important ground station stuff using cloud computing. Now that's cheaper and more efficient for sure, but it also puts a ton of eggs in one basket and creates this huge, juicy target for cyber attacks that could knock out satellite communications for a lot of people.
So, let's take a step back. You've got the cables on the ocean floor, the shipping lanes on the surface, and the satellite ground stations connecting to the sky. When you look at it all together, you realize this whole physical system, the real internet, has become a massive geopolitical battleground.
And every major player has their own strategy for this new game. China is throwing billions at building new routes, trying to find a way around the Malacca Strait. Russia is playing it sneaky, using a shadow fleet and spy ships to fly under the radar. Meanwhile, the US is playing a game of power projection and alliances, trying to keep the whole system open.
But trying to protect all this stuff is a huge, tangled mess. Just look at the US, for example. You'd think there'd be one single government agency in charge of protecting these incredibly important undersea cables, right? Wrong. There isn't one. And the challenges are just massive. For starters, private companies own almost all of it. Then it crosses all these different international borders with different laws. And on top of all that, there's no single coordinated plan to protect it. It's this messy web of private companies, international law, and national security all tangled up together.
And this really gets to the core problem, doesn't it? Think about this. Over 99% of the data that runs our world flows through a system that is absolutely essential for everyone, but it's almost completely owned and run by private companies.
So that leaves us with one giant question. In a world where the threats are constantly changing, from a clumsy ship anchor one day to a sophisticated cyber attack the next, whose job is it to protect this invisible, fragile, and totally essential network that every single one of us relies on every single day?